Welcome to the Unraveling the Scriptures channel. Have you ever heard of an enemy so cruel that God declared war against them from generation to generation? A treacherous people who did not face their enemies head-on but attacked from behind, always targeting the weakest, the weary, and the defenseless. This people appears repeatedly in the pages of the Bible, carrying the mark of violence, rebellion against God, and relentless persecution of the people of Israel. Today, we will dive into the story of the Amalekites, a people who became a living symbol of opposition to the divine will and, at the same time, of God's unfailing justice. What you are about to hear may transform the way you see some of the most striking battles of Scripture. The Amalekites, descendants of Amalek, grandson of Esau, the brother of Jacob, carried in their lineage a heritage marked by conflict and contrast. They were not distant foreigners, but blood relatives of the Israelites, linked by roots that went back to the same womb of Isaac and Rebekah. And precisely for this reason, every clash between them was not limited to political or territorial matters. There was a profound spiritual dimension, almost as if the ancient rivalry between Esau and Jacob continued to echo through the generations. On one side, the children of Jacob had been chosen to walk under the promise, guardians of the covenant established by the living God, called to live not only as a people, but as a consecrated nation. On the other side, the descendants of Amalek followed a path of opposition. They did not embrace faith in God. They did not bow to his law. They did not recognize his sovereignty. They preferred the road of rebellion, and in that choice, they became a wandering people, nomads roaming the vast deserts without spiritual roots, sustained more by the force of violence than by the hope of a promise. The setting of their formation was the arid land of the Negev, a region where the sun burned mercilessly and where sources of water were as scarce as hidden treasures. There, a people learned to be resilient, hardened by harsh conditions. But it was not only the desert that shaped them, it was the hardness of their own hearts. What distinguished them was not the ability to survive where many would perish, but the cruelty that became their identity. The environment gave them endurance, but they transformed it into brutality. They became a people of cunning and plunder, known not for hospitality or wisdom, but for violence against those who crossed their paths. And thus, more than mere adversaries, the Amalekites became declared enemies of the divine purpose. They were like a constant shadow, a symbol of opposition against God's eternal plans. Where Israel represented the promise, Amalek represented resistance to the promise. Where Israel symbolized obedience and faith, Amalek stood as the figure of rebellion and impiety. The first recorded encounter between these two nations took place at Refidim, soon after Israel's exodus from Egypt. It was a newly freed people, still learning how to live outside the chains of slavery. Their backs carried the weight of centuries of servitude, and their hearts wavered between hope and uncertainty. In the wilderness, freedom was still a painful lesson, marked by hunger, thirst, and the constant trials of the journey. Israel was like a child taking its first steps, fragile, vulnerable, but sustained by the invisible hand of God through the leadership of Moses. It was precisely at this moment of greatest weakness that the Amalekites rose against them. They did not come in open challenge. They did not declare war in fairness. They attacked treacherously, taking advantage of the vulnerability of a weary people. They came like silent predators, approaching the outskirts of the camp, where the most defenseless were, the elderly who walked with slow steps, the mothers carrying their little children, the sick who could barely continue the journey. It was not a battle between equals, but an act of cowardice disguised as war. In that attack, the Amalekites revealed not only their combat strategy, but also the essence of who they were, an essence marked by the absence of fear of God and by the lack of compassion for others. Their war was not only against Israel, it was against what Israel represented, the promise, the faith, and the presence of the Lord among his people. Moses, discerning the gravity of the threat rising against Israel, understood that this was not just another desert skirmish, but a challenge that threatened the survival and identity of the newly liberated people. The urgency left him no room to hesitate. He then called Joshua, a young man emerging as a leader within the community, and entrusted him with the task of gathering men for battle. It was an unprecedented calling. For the first time, the children of Israel would not march as runaway slaves, but would rise as warriors, taking a stand to defend the inheritance God had already promised them. While Joshua descended into the valley with the fighters, Moses took another path, the path not traced with swords, but with faith. He did not seek the front lines, but the top of the mountain, the place where the human heart meets heaven. Accompanied by Aaron and Hur, he positioned himself there as an intercessor, standing not in physical strength but in spiritual dependence. And it was on that mountain that a seemingly simple gesture took on eternal dimensions. Moses lifted his hands toward heaven, and that raising of arms became more than just a posture. It was the public confession that victory would not come from human strength, but from the mighty arm of the Lord. Every moment his hands remained raised, Israel prevailed over the Amalekites in the valley. But when weariness weighed on his arms and they fell, the enemy regained strength and advanced against them. Thus it became clear that the battle was not being decided only on the arid ground of Refidim, but also in the unseen realm, in the space where faith, obedience, and intercession determine the course of history. This divine mystery revealed a truth that would echo through the centuries. It is not the strength of the sword that secures the victory of God's people, but perseverance in prayer. It is not the warrior's skill that guarantees triumph, but the faithfulness of the intercessor who stands firm before the throne of the Most High. Seeing Moses struggle against the weight of time and fatigue, Aaron and Hur did not remain indifferent. They recognized the gravity of the moment and placed themselves at his side, holding up his arms, one on each side, so they would not fall. And so they remained, steady and unwavering, until the sun set. What happened on that mountain was more than a scene of human support. It was a living portrait of unity and cooperation within God's purpose. Three men, different in role, but united in spirit. Moses interceded, Joshua fought, Aaron and Hur sustained, each fulfilling his part, but all sharing in the same victory. Thus, on that day, Israel won its first battle as a nation. It was not merely the record of a military triumph over a treacherous enemy, but the birth of a spiritual truth that would mark its history. The episode at Refidim taught the people that God's victories are not built only in the visible arena of war, but also in the secret cry of those who rise up in prayer. The valley and the mountain became inseparable symbols. While some wield swords, others lift hands, and only in the union of these forces does victory become complete. After Refidim, the Lord left no room for doubt or forgetfulness. The event was not to be treated as a simple memory of a military victory, nor as a tale to be told from father to son around the fire. God himself commanded Moses to record what had happened in writing, engraving it as an eternal memorial and also as a decree. The Amalekite attack would not be forgotten, and God's judgment against them would be proclaimed from generation to generation until their memory was completely erased from the face of the earth. The sentence of the Most High was not the fruit of a sudden impulse, nor merely retribution for an act of cowardice. It was the just judgment of God against the arrogance of a people who not only dared to face Israel in their weakness, but in doing so directly defied the Lord himself. What was at stake was not only tired caravans, weakened bodies, or a newly freed people. At stake was the eternal plan of the Creator, the purpose that led Israel toward the promise. To attack the weary was, in truth, to raise a hand against the one who sustains the weak and makes the powerless march. In Deuteronomy 25, centuries later, the voice of God still echoes with the same firmness, as one who does not forget the injustice committed. The Lord reminds his people of what had happened at Refidim, recalling not only the fact of the war, but the cruelty of the Amalekite strategy. They did not face Israel in open field. They did not seek a fair confrontation between armies. They chose a treacherous attack, coming from behind, targeting the weary, the frail, those who could no longer keep up with the march. It was more than violence. It was contempt for compassion, arrogance before reverence, the raw expression of a heart hardened against God. And that is why the Lord's decree was not limited to a circumstantial order. It was a solemn, eternal judgment, inscribed in the history of Israel as an inescapable duty. When the people finally enjoyed rest and peace in the Promised Land, they were to fulfill the divine sentence, to erase the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. No trace, no remembrance, no opportunity for their arrogance to echo through generations. Thus, the Amalekites became more than an enemy people. They became a symbol, a living representation of spiritual rebellion that insists on rising against the plans of the Most High. The war against them would not be just a territorial dispute between neighboring nations, but the fulfillment of divine justice, which transcends time and space. The sentence against Amalek thus stands as a solemn warning for all ages. Even though wickedness may seem to triumph for a moment, even though the wicked may exalt themselves before the weakness of the righteous, they will never remain unpunished in the eyes of God. The Lord is just, and his judgment, though it may often appear delayed to human eyes, always comes in the fullness of time. Thus, the memorial of the Amalekites was not only about a defeated enemy, but about the Lord's faithfulness in defending his people. It was the reminder that God hears the cry of the weak, that he does not ignore injustice, and that his justice is as certain as the sunrise over the sands of the desert. The years advanced like the ceaseless waves of time, and centuries piled upon the history of Israel. Peoples disappeared, empires rose and fell, but the word of the Lord remained standing, unshaken, like an eternal rock. What had been decreed at Refidim, when the Amalekites dared to challenge not only Israel but God himself, was neither lost in the dust of the desert nor erased from heavenly memory. Judgment was stored up for the Lord's appointed time, and when the hour arrived, he once again brought to light what he had promised. Through the prophet Samuel, the divine command was given to Saul, the king chosen to lead Israel, to utterly destroy the Amalekites. There was to be no compassion, no preservation, no remembrance left of their name or possessions. Men, women, children, servants, herds, and wealth, all were to be given over to the Lord's judgment, as though the very fire of heaven consumed the memory of a people whose mark was rebellion. This mission was not a military conquest, nor an effort to glorify Israel. It was not a war like others, in which kingdoms sought land, riches, or prestige. It was a solemn execution, an act of divine justice against a people who, generation after generation, chose to remain in opposition to the Lord. The command was clear. This was not about plunder, but about judgment, not about victory, but about purification. Saul, however, though he partially obeyed, failed to fully carry out the command of the Most High. He gathered the army, marched against the Amalekites, and achieved a great victory. His soldiers defeated the enemies and devastated their cities. Yet instead of utterly destroying everything that represented the rebellion of that people, Saul spared what seemed most valuable. The king of the Amalekites, Agag, was spared. And this was no small detail. Agag was not merely a common ruler, but the ultimate symbol of opposition against the Lord. His very name carried the weight of blood and violence. As monarch, he had led raids, plunder, and campaigns against Israel and other desert peoples. He embodied the continuation of a lineage marked by wickedness, the throne of a nation built on cruelty and contempt for others. To spare him was, in essence, to spare the very heart of the rebellion that God had condemned. It was as if Saul had left alive the root of the evil that the Most High had commanded to be torn out by the root. In addition, Saul and his army kept the best of the spoil: oxen, sheep, lambs, and wealth that should have been destroyed. The fattest animals, the healthiest flocks, the most precious possessions, all that represented human prosperity, was separated as loot. And then, to justify his choice, Saul cloaked himself in religious appearance. He claimed that he had kept those animals to offer them as sacrifices to the Lord. But in the eyes of the Most High, that excuse was empty. What Saul did not understand was that the spoils were a test of faithfulness. The Lord did not need oxen or lambs, for he is the owner of all creation. The command to destroy everything was not about the flesh or the gold, but about the human heart. The very fact that Saul looked upon the herds and desired to preserve them revealed where his trust rested, not in the word of God, but in the apparent value of wealth. Thus, under the mask of devotion, Saul revealed his true weakness, the inability to fully obey. What looked like religious zeal was, in reality, disguised rebellion. The king sought to reshape God's command to his own convenience, trading obedience for the vanity of outward worship. And in doing so, he showed that it is possible to defeat armies before men and yet be defeated before God, to bring offerings to the altar and yet lose the favor of the Most High. When Samuel came to meet Saul, he did not find a repentant king broken before his failure, but a man eager to justify himself. Saul ran to the prophet as one seeking approval, trying to cover his transgression with words of devotion. He presented his excuses as though they were offerings, attempting to transform disobedience into an act of piety. But Samuel's gaze, carrying divine authority, was not deceived by speeches. The prophet, as spokesman of the Most High, let fall upon Saul words that have echoed through time as an eternal sentence. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. In that pronouncement, Samuel was not speaking only to Israel's king, but establishing for all the history of faith the essence of the relationship between God and his people. The Lord does not delight in rituals that try to mask rebellious hearts. He is not pleased with altars covered in offerings if those who bring them are unwilling to obey. What sustains the covenant is not outward acts, but a submissive, sincere heart, willing to yield completely to the divine will. And so, in the very core of Israel's story, an eternal lesson was engraved. Disobedience, even when dressed in good intentions, is unfaithfulness before God. And true worship is not in abundant sacrifices, but in hearts that bow without reservation. Worship without obedience is empty. Religiosity without surrender is rejected. Seized with holy indignation, Samuel raised his voice not only as a prophet, but as a judge of the Lord. And before the king who had failed to fulfill the command, he announced the irrevocable sentence. Saul had been rejected as king because he had rejected the word of the Most High. The one who had been chosen to lead Israel, the first to sit on the nation's throne, would lose his crown not by military defeat, but by spiritual defeat. A reign that could have been marked by faithfulness and blessing became a fragile throne, corroded by disobedience and pride. Before the people, Samuel assumed the mission that Saul had refused to complete. The prophet could not turn back time nor rewrite history, but he could demonstrate before all that the Lord's judgment is not negotiable. Agag, king of the Amalekites, was brought before Samuel. He, who had been spared by Saul, walked with confidence, perhaps believing that his life had been preserved as a sign of triumph or clemency. His face bore the arrogance of one who, even defeated on the battlefield, still considered himself invincible before the justice of men. But Samuel, in the name of the Lord, showed that there was no room for arrogance before the divine decree. There, before the eyes of Israel, the prophet executed Agag, ending the life of the one who symbolized rebellion against God. The act was harsh, bloody, but necessary. It was not personal vengeance nor gratuitous violence. It was the fulfillment of the sentence that God himself had pronounced. With that act, Samuel showed all that the word of the Lord cannot be relativized nor postponed for human convenience. What the Most High determines must be carried out, even if it seems harsh to human eyes. This episode became a watershed in Israel's memory. It revealed a truth that would echo as a solemn warning. It is not enough to be involved in God's work. One must obey completely. In the eyes of the Lord, partial obedience is total disobedience. Saul's failure did not cost him just a mission, it cost him the kingdom itself. His crown crumbled not before enemy swords, but before his own unfaithfulness. Thus, Saul's fall became an example for all generations. One cannot toy with God's will, nor replace it with pious excuses. Faith that disobeys is not faith. Worship that ignores the divine command is abomination. The episode revealed that the true greatness of a leader is not in his strength or strategy, but in his unreserved obedience to the voice of the Lord. With Saul's rejection, the Lord raised up David, a man after his own heart, to reign over Israel. And in contrast to his predecessor, David showed firmness and faithfulness against the Amalekites. When they rose against him, David spared no effort, left no breach, and did not retreat before their defiance. In decisive battles, he achieved overwhelming victories, rescuing families taken captive, recovering spoils, and restoring hope to his people. Where there was fear, he brought confidence. Where there was oppression, he brought relief. And where the memory of Amalekite treachery still lingered, he raised the banner of victory under the hand of the Lord. Yet even then, the story of the Amalekites did not end immediately. Though defeated many times, small groups survived, resisting in the shadows of history. It was only many years later, in the reign of King Hezekiah, that the last remnants were destroyed at Mount Seir. There, at last, the word of the Lord was fulfilled in full, and Israel experienced peace in the region. These victories carry within them a profound message. The enemy may resist for a time, but before the faithfulness and obedience to the Lord, victory is certain and complete. The fulfillment of the promise may seem delayed, but God's timing is perfect. He does not fail, he does not forget, and he never abandons his people. The story of the Amalekites is not merely a distant record of the past, but a living testimony that echoes to our days, bringing spiritual and moral lessons of great value. One of the first truths it teaches us is the importance of complete obedience to God. Saul tried to walk halfway, fulfilling part of the Lord's command, but his partial disobedience cost him not only the throne, but also divine approval itself. This reminds us that with God, there is no middle ground. Either we obey fully, or we are rejecting his will. Another powerful lesson is that the Amalekites became the symbol of opposition to God's purposes. They remind us that, in our journey, we too will face resistance, challenges that arise to test our faith, shake our confidence, and tempt us to give up. Yet, just as with Israel, victory is guaranteed when we trust in the Lord with all our heart, when we remain steadfast even in the face of struggles, and when we unite in prayer and perseverance. This account is also a warning against cowardice and cruelty. The Amalekites' treacherous attacks showed that evil may prosper for a time, but it will bring inevitable consequences. In contrast, faithfulness, justice, and integrity remain as paths of blessing. It is a reminder that every act carries weight before God, and that he is just in judging and rewarding. Finally, the narrative of the Amalekites shows us that God is faithful in all his promises. Even if the enemy resists, even if battles seem unending, the Lord acts at the right time. His justice prevails, his hand guides, and his presence protects. Israel faced visible enemies. We face inner and outer struggles every day, but the message is the same. With faith, obedience, and unity, no opposition can withstand the power of our God. May this story strengthen your heart and inspire you to trust fully in the Lord, even when the battles seem greater than your strength. He walks with you every step, sustains your life, and grants victory to those who do not give up. If this message spoke to your heart, and you want more people to be reached by the word, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This way, you help spread the truth of Scripture and receive content that strengthens faith week after week. Also, activate the notification bell so you don't miss any updates, and I'd love to hear from you. What part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave your comment below. Let's talk and share faith with one another. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. See you soon.